Colonized or oppressed peoples shall have the right to free themselves from the bonds of domination by resorting to any means recognized by the international community. I'm not really sure how to start a video like this. By necessity, it's going to have a very different tone to what regulars will be used to. And that's because the series of events that prompted this topic are deeply serious. They're long-standing, and they deserve actual thought. Which is why this video wasn't released on October 8th, for example, because I've taken my time with it. Before we get into the video itself, I need to explain a couple of things. Firstly, how I'm going to actually do this video. You see, the YouTube algorithm dislikes certain topics and certain words, and one of the ways people get around this is by speaking in, like, analogy, or pausing when words like or need to be said and then showing them on screen like I've just demonstrated. I think doing that detracts a little bit from what I want to do here. So in the case of words like, I'm just going to save a word from now on, and in the case of names of groups that the YouTube algorithm is probably going to get pretty mad at me for saying, like, or I'll just use the full official English name in the hopes that the YouTube algorithm is a little bit too dumb to catch on to it. In case it does though, if there ever was a video that I really need you to like and share wherever you want to share it, it's this one, because I suspect the YouTube algorithm is not going to like this one as much as the Liz Truss one I just did. The next thing I need to explain is why I've chosen to do this video on Palestine, in case it wasn't obvious what I was doing it about. The latest escalations that have happened and how they connect more broadly to historical and contemporary resistances. It's a good question because my general policy on this channel has been to keep to myself, speak about things where I know I'm on firm ground, and just try not to dive into topics where my feelings are so strong that it might detract from the topic itself. I'll probably talk about those feelings and where they've come from because it's important for me to get that out there, probably for my own sake. But why am I breaking probably my only rule on the channel? There's two reasons. The first is that the situation itself is so urgent that saying nothing feels untenable and like being complicit. The scale of the devastation that this specific chapter of this long-standing issue has brought is shocking, and the reaction of the political class and the press has compounded this for me. At the time of recording, 10,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip, at least 25,000 wounded, and around 2,500 are missing. The number of displaced people at the time of recording is estimated to be around 1.5 million in Gaza, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, where people have no real way of escaping the violence that is being done to them. It's also important to note that violence is also being done to Palestinians in the West Bank, and this has escalated alongside this escalation. Israel issued a demand and an order that people in North Gaza leave, and given that the people in Gaza are often the descendants of refugees themselves, and incidentally therefore also entitled to return to the land that their ancestors were expelled from, they looked upon this with skepticism and with a long collective cultural memory. Never mind that the order itself was impossible to complete in compliance with the original 24-hour deadline that was given, but people did heed that warning, they did leave, and their reward was to be bombed. This is what genocide looks like. We've seen these elements before, and it might be controversial to say that, but that doesn't make it less true. The second reason is that the country where I live, which is the UK, and in several countries within the global north, there has been a years-long concerted political effort undertaken across the political spectrum to make speech, protests, and political action in support of Palestinian liberation either outright illegal or basically untenable, which has intensified as Israel's brutal actions towards Palestinians have intensified. For example, in France, the authorities banned pro-Palestinian protests, and when people correctly defied the order, They were broken up with tear gas and water cannons. The Interior Minister Gerald Darmanin said, "Pro-Palestinian demonstrations must be prohibited because they are likely to generate disturbances to the public order," which in the context of him being the guy who said to her face, incidentally, that noted fascist Marine Le Pen was too soft on Islam, is incredibly chilling given that anti-Palestinian feeling is often directly connected to Islamophobia. In Austria, Vienna police banned pro-Palestinian protests over the use of the chant "From river to sea, Palestine will be free," interpreting it, deliberately and incorrectly for political purposes, as a call to violence. In Germany, the government has thrown its backing completely behind Israel, and the federal and state governments have banned pro-Palestinian protests, pro-Palestinian speeches, and even the keffiyeh, an item of clothing commonly associated with the Palestinians. The German police also engaged in violence against pro-Palestinian protesters in an attempt to suppress them. Germany's relationship to Israel and its root in its guilt for the Holocaust are a lot for the video that's already going to be having an awful lot in it, but understand that Germany has a very particular and very anti-Palestinian political atmosphere rooted in that guilt that exists, again, across the political spectrum. An example is a so-called Antifa group in Germany throwing jars of pig fat at a housing complex with mostly Muslims in it. The German Vice-Chancellor, a member of the Green Party, said that too few Muslims have distanced themselves from anti-Semitism and the Islamic resistance movement in Germany. If they are foreigners, they risk deportation, and Germans risk prosecution. A deeply racist and troublesome sentiment, given Germany's particular historic relationship to minorities, and a statement that if it were made about Jewish people in the diaspora, would rightly be the subject of mass outcry. In the US, 38 states have laws that are anti-BDS, and that is in reference to the campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, which, as we'll see, is a style of campaigning that has been done throughout history against unjust regimes, and that is crucially entirely peaceful. In addition, the United States has been one of the staunchest supporters of Israel historically, as well as falling into a mire of Islamophobia, particularly with the war on terror in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. America has also arrested anti-war and pro-Palestinian protesters, including Jewish anti-war activists who were chanting "Not in our name" in a protest which was, as far as I could tell, entirely peaceful until, as always, the police show up and use violence, which is what arresting people is. Then we come to the UK, where I live. The issue of Israel-Palestine has, over the past decade or so, been thrust into quite significant prominence in British politics, to the point that a lot of the radicalization I spoke about in that other video I did about centrists had attitudes to this issue at the heart of it. I would argue it was more what Israel represents as a colonial frontier, and that to be seen as critical of it would be to be seen as too close or friendly to them, where them was Muslims and brown people, even though there are a lot of Palestinian Christians as well. So, again, racists are not clever people. Setting that aside, this catapulting of the issue into the heart of British politics has definitely degraded the seriousness with which it's sort of meant to be taken, and it's meant that both the government and the opposition are following the foreign policy orthodoxy and leadership of the United States, who not only seek to criminalize support for the Palestinians, but provides around $4 billion a year in military aid to Israel, which, as far as I could tell, is mostly spent on buying weapons from American companies. Plus, they've sent a carrier group to show support for Israel. The UK's also deployed the Royal Navy to Israel, but aside from the foreign policy, this issue has also had profound impacts domestically. For example, Suella Braverman, Britain's horror show Home Secretary, advised the police that waving the Palestinian flag may not be legitimate if intended to glorify acts of terrorism. This is not in reference or response to anything that's actually happened, as far as I can tell. It's an attempt to make the symbol of the Palestinian flag associated with those acts. Waving or displaying the Palestinian flag is not to indicate support for the Islamic resistance movement, because they are not synonymous with the Palestinian people, a point I will be repeating until I need to stop repeating it. The UK is also trying to pass a law that will ban public bodies such as elected local councils from boycotting or divesting from foreign countries and territories. Now, this doesn't specifically say you cannot boycott or divest from Israel, but the obvious intention is that it would ban BDS. There is also a McCarthyite atmosphere where even a politician saying the things that are expected is summarily ignored and the left-bashing line is taken, because the point isn't to protect Jewish people in the UK, it's to use the issue to bludgeon the left out of public life. To give an example of just how detached from, not just reality, but immediate stimuli conservatives and doctrinal supporters of Israel in the UK have gotten, here's a clip where you would think two totally different moments have been spliced together.
The killings on October the 7th were appalling, and they have to be totally condemned, as everyone has done today. The loss, however, of 5,000 Palestinian lives in Gaza is continuing and getting worse. The question is, why did the Prime Minister instruct Britain's representative at the UN not to support the call for a very minimal thing, which is a humanitarian pause to allow aid to go in and a ceasefire to take place to start to bring about a process of peace? Ultimately, that's the only way forward. Ultimately, the only way forward is the end to the occupation. Ultimately, the only way forward is recognition of the rights of the people of Palestine.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our regional and diplomatic engagement has extensively been focused about how we can bring about a better and brighter future for the people of Palestine and the Palestinians. But I would say to the Honourable Gentleman, I'm surprised he hasn't made any reference to the fact that an organisation that he once described as a friend has perpetrated an absolutely appalling act of terrorism on
a senior MP, Andy MacDonald, was also suspended from the Labour Party for a speech that contained the following quote, and I want you to try and pay close attention to it, so that you can see if there's anything to object to here. We won't rest until we have justice, until all people, Israelis and Palestinians between the river and the sea, can live in peaceful liberty. Now, you might think he was suspended for essentially tone policing Palestinians and warping a call for their liberty, but you would be wrong. The issue here was supposedly anti-Semitism. So yeah, this is a lot. The combination of the urgency in Palestine and the atmosphere around this issue in the UK and the wider Western world has made silence, at least on my part, basically untenable. I understand the people who say I have nothing constructive to add, because in 90% of cases that's probably a really good instinct to have. I don't believe people who choose to take that line on this issue are being malicious. It is incumbent on us, though, who live in countries whose governments unconditionally support Israel, who supply it with weapons, who provide it with diplomatic cover, to use our voices and platforms, no matter how small or large they may be. To look at the situation as it exists and choose violence is to choose cowardice. And when so many people are in need, I can't do that, and I don't think you should either. With that context, I want to use this video to not just talk about Palestine, but to connect it to historical conflicts which have involved resistances to colonialism, occupation, racism including apartheid. And I want to do this broadly through kind of a series of questions and thoughts that often come up when talking about this. So let's try our best with this video. Let me start with an uncontroversial statement. Slavery is bad. Hopefully we all accept that statement at face value and think of it rather simply. But the idea that someone can own another person in bondage and force them to perform labor is wrong. There is no ambiguity, and crucially, there is no complexity in there, right? It doesn't matter which specific expression of slavery we speak about, whether it's the chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere, the Ottoman devshirme system that led to the so-called slave aristocracy, which just not going to get into Roman gladiators, galley slaves impressed into service, or any other system used throughout history and in the modern day. These are all unambiguously bad and uncomplicated. Yes, there may have been a variety of conditions for each of those types of slave I mentioned, but the fact that they were the property of another person is so morally repugnant that everyone watching this video will be repulsed by each of them. If we accept the statement, slavery is bad, with all of its simplicity, then it stands to reason that wanting to end slavery is good. We benefit from historical distance that means that in a lot of specific cases that we can say that very easily, right? Of course, we would have been abolitionists because that's so obviously the right thing to be. John Brown did nothing wrong is substantially easier to say in 2023 than it would have been right after Bleeding Kansas. Though it's crucial to point out that it was said by some people at the time. Before anyone gets into the how could they have known better arguments, they could have known better because there were contemporaries who did, which feels familiar in an eerie way. Let's turn our attention to Haiti. At the time we're going to be talking about it, it was called Saint-Domingue, a French colony that mostly had a plantation economy, sugar and then a bit later coffee. The thing about cash crops like that is, as the name implies, you can get filthy fucking rich selling them. But there's a problem. Free people expect to get paid for their work, and that's expensive. What if we could eliminate a significant portion of labor expenses and maximize the amount of cash crops we produce? This is how you end up with a substantial population of slaves, to oversimplify because this isn't really the point of what I'm saying. The institution of chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere and the transatlantic slave trade were horrifying. If you're in a good mood and you'd like to ruin it, I'd recommend reading basically any material about slavery in places like Brazil and Argentina, both of indigenous people and people taken from Africa. In Haiti, and indeed across the Western Hemisphere, enslaved people did not simply endure their bondage. There were regular revolts, and part of the reason for this was that among the enslaved population in Haiti, the death rate was higher than the birth rate, meaning constant replacements were required, and these recently imported slaves tended to be less willing to accept their situation, having been previously free, unlike those born into slavery. What I've described so far is a simple situation, both on the slavery bad level and on a basic emotional level. To really run through it all, here's the 200-word summary of the Haitian Revolution and its aftermath. And I know it's not going to be complete, and I know there's going to be gaps, and I know it's not very thorough of me, but we have limited time, okay? Toussaint Louverture led one of the most successful slave revolts of all time. The British entered the conflict and restored slavery wherever they went, which made them hated. France abolished slavery in an attempt to secure the colony for their new republican government. Louverture joins the French, kicks the Spanish off the island, repels the Royal Navy when they have a go at trying to take the island again. Toussaint Louverture consolidates power, defeats a revolt. Napoleon reinstates slavery, gets defeated in the Haitian War of Independence, but not before Louverture is betrayed in 1802 and imprisoned in France, which leads to Jean-Jacques Dessalines taking control and seeing through the independence of Haiti. Dessalines then authorizes and leads reprisals against the island's slave-owning whites, with some whites exempted from this, including a group of Polish defectors who came with Napoleon's forces to the island and decided to fight with the Haitians against slavery, and Germans who hadn't participated in the slave trade. My point in sort of explaining that is to say that Dessalines targeted the roots of slave power in his reprisals. These reprisals included the killing of former slave owners and their families. Dessalines didn't hide it either, referring to the massacre of slave owners, their families, and the white colonists who benefited from the slave trade on the island. He said, "Yes, I have saved my country. I have avenged America." Suddenly, You might be feeling a little bit like this is complicated, especially if I tell you that the massacre created a legacy of racial tension in Haiti, and that a bunch of very harsh laws were put into place in relation to the white population, excluding those that weren't considered white, like Poles and Germans on the island. That's my point, though. It feels complicated. Slavery is still bad. That's still simple. You're not meant to feel good about what Dessalines did, but the abolition of slavery is an unambiguous good and a simple thing to understand. Horrible things can be done in a resistance to a great evil. That doesn't necessarily justify them, but it helps us to understand why they happen. It also helps us to understand that while we may have complex feelings about the situations themselves, they can be simple, and the solutions can be even simpler. If the white population of Haiti did not want this to happen to them, it seems to me they could have avoided it in 2 simple steps. 1, not enslaving anyone, and 2, failing that, freeing the slaves. In the same way, we might look at Palestine and the events of October 7th and feel complexity. The fact is that the things that Palestinians are victims of, that is, settler colonialism, white supremacy, apartheid, and genocide, are simply bad. And the solution to avoiding things like the Islamic resistance movement's surprise attack is to simply stop doing those things to the Palestinians. Perhaps the lesson of what Dessalines ordered is that we shouldn't allow simple situations to get to that point. Let me tell you something about myself. I was born on the 3rd of April 1994. So aside from that making me almost 30 at the release of this video, it also means I was born 24 days before the negotiations to end apartheid in South Africa were concluded. What should you take away from this? 1, that I'm old enough that the term family computer actually means something to me. And 2, that apartheid is both historically distant, but also disturbingly recent. Historical distance is a luxury, not through any of our choices. You don't choose when to be born. It does give us certain benefits though, like with apartheid we can all hopefully agree to a similar simple statement to the one I offered before. Apartheid is bad. It's easy for us to say that because apartheid in South Africa is no longer the issue that's demanding our attention because it was ended. A lot of us say apartheid is bad without really knowing what it is, and it's going to be important for us to have an idea of that. So let's turn to the Rome Statute for a definition of the crime of apartheid. The crime of apartheid means inhumane acts of a character similar to those referred to in paragraph 1, committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. The crime of apartheid is one that Israel is often accused of, not just by the PLO or by Palestinians, who do make that accusation and are correct to make it. Israel has also been called an apartheid regime by Amnesty International, UN investigators, and by B'Tselem, an Israeli NGO. Particular attention was paid to the nation-state law, which was pretty controversial in Israel and probably brought down at least one government there, but it enshrined Jewish settlement as a national value itself, an act of colonialism, and established that national rights only belonged to Jewish Israelis, in effect a regime of racial domination over the Palestinians. The comparison to apartheid South Africa is one that's made quite often, and you might think that it's done for a good reason. That's because it is an apartheid state like South Africa was. In fact, after a UN vote where Israel voted against South African apartheid, then Prime Minister of South Africa, Hendrik Verwoerd, said Israel is not consistent in its new anti-apartheid attitude. They took Israel away from the Arabs after the Arabs lived there for 1,000 years. In that I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. Now, we shouldn't take the Prime Minister of Apartheid South Africa at his word, because he was the head of a racist regime. But Israel was very much a regime built in the same mold. The question arises, what resistance was made by black South Africans and their allies against apartheid? We have a habit, because of our historical distance, and to be honest, because of the way we've been told the story in the global north, to think about the ending. You might think of Nelson Mandela as having gone from one of the world's most high-profile political prisoners to president of South Africa, and that's it, right? That's the story. One very, very important guy who was in prison, ended up being released, and being elected president in the first multiracial elections in South Africa. No need to look into this any further. Except, you do end up wondering why Mandela was in prison at all, and what exactly persuaded South Africa to begin negotiations to end apartheid. It's time for a 350-word summary of some of the history, which I know isn't enough words, I'm aware of it, but just bear with me. Before South Africa existed, there were several separate colonial states in that area. The one that's of interest to us for this part of the story is the Cape Colony, which had a system known as the qualified franchise, which allowed all men, regardless of race, to vote. Now, in practice, that was not strictly the case, but in principle, it was. The qualified franchise was gradually eroded under various governments, including under Cecil Rhodes, who seems to be the final boss of colonialism in Southern Africa. The ANC is formed in 1912, whose purpose is to agitate for the rights of black South Africans. In 1948, the United National Party, a creatively named alliance of the United and National Parties, both far-right white supremacist pro-apartheid parties, won the election and legally mandated apartheid. And before anyone asks, yes, they basically did run on a platform of, we're racist and we want to do racism. And they won. Pretty comfortably too. Opposition to apartheid became the ANC's primary focus from this point. The ANC was eventually taken over by a more radical African nationalist and Marxist-influenced faction in their youth organisation, and engaged in a campaign of defiance through the 50s, until the ANC was banned in 1960. The Sharpeville Massacre, which happened in the same year, catalyzed the idea that non-violent resistance alone would not lead to the end of apartheid. So the South African Communist Party and the ANC formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, or Spear of the Nation, as their armed wing. MK would go on to engage in a military campaign against the apartheid regime, including targeting civilians. The ANC and Nelson Mandela were condemned as terrorists. In fact, Nelson Mandela would remain on the US's terror watch list until 2008. External and internal pressure, which included MK and other armed groups' campaigns, would eventually compel the apartheid government to begin to negotiate towards a political settlement, which brings us to the part of the story we all know: Mandela released, multiracial elections, and truth and reconciliation, where people who had committed acts like the targeting of civilians could apply for amnesty in exchange for testimony about what they did, so that the full history would be accessible to everyone of who did what during that period. Which I find really interesting, because I think we'd agree that even if you've been wronged, you don't then get the right to do something wrong to the people who had wronged you, right? Sometimes, though, circumstances take that out of your hand. In the absence of an obvious political path to their rights, blacks and their allies in South Africa took to armed struggle, and after the armed struggle achieved its goals, they didn't exculpate themselves like Desayim did. They tried restorative justice, a flawed attempt at it, and there are criticisms to be made, but the acknowledgement that even if you were oppressed, on the side of the oppressed, that you still did the bad thing, and it was still wrong, is an important idea for all of this, because we hopefully would find apartheid to be repulsive and something to be opposed, even if the ANC and MK and their allies did these things, which they admitted. Apartheid is still bad. we should still oppose it wherever this form of government rears its head, and no matter what acts are done in opposition to it, because the fact of it being bad is simple and clear. Let me ask you a question. Imagine if you owned a house, 2 bedrooms, smallish garden, shed in the garden, and some guy shows up one day and says, "Hey, so I grew up in this house," and you're like, "Cool, do you maybe want to look around or something?" Just because you suspect the guy is on a nostalgia trip, and you don't want to be rude, and he doesn't seem like a bad guy, maybe a bit weird, but nothing malicious. Then he reveals that not only does he want to look around, but he's brought an entire squad of policemen, and they're going to make you live in the shed now. Not just that, but you can't go to work through your old house without a permit, otherwise the police will beat you up. But also you're not allowed to jump over the fences to your neighbour's house and go to work that way, because they're treating the guy who stole your house with kids' gloves because he might set the squad of policemen onto them, and they just don't want to upset him. You would feel pretty exceedingly negative about that guy. You might even want to punch that guy in the face, even knowing that the police would smash up the shed you're living in. That's a rather ham-fisted analogy, but it's trying to explain what's exactly at the root of this. Occupation and colonialism are at the root of this conflict, regardless of what people might want you to believe. This did not begin on October 7th, 2023. We hear those words thrown around a lot in the context of Palestine. We don't really sit and think about what it really means. There are some different interpretations of the precise moment occupation began in the case of Palestinians. Like, for me, I think it began in 1948 because the occupation and the colonial project go hand in hand. Something that's not a productive view. I don't care. It's the correct view. And these actions also factor into another ongoing process, genocide, which I promise we will get to in a little bit. Occupation is rather simple to understand. It's the control of territory that belongs to another entity or people. Israel is recognized as occupying the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria, the West Bank, which has been occupied since 1967, which is the more recognized date for the beginning of the occupation, and the Gaza Strip, since Israel maintains a regime of control over its land borders, except for the Rafah crossing with Egypt, airspace and nautical territory. That is also the regime of control that allows the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant to call for a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off water, fuel, electricity, food, and medical supplies, a war crime and an act of collective punishment. When confronted by occupation, we have a number of examples of how people resist it. For example, in Nazi-occupied France, miners went on strike. These strikes occurred alongside military resistance to the Nazis, or, to keep it in World War II, the campaigns of the Yugoslav partisans, which were the only partisan movement to free their country through their own direct efforts from fascist occupation. Or, we might take the case of the Viet Cong. While the Vietnam War was ostensibly a civil war between two rival Vietnamese governments, the fact is that one of these governments was much more amenable to governing on behalf of former and current imperial powers in the region than the communists were. That's why the umbrella group the Viet Cong belonged to is called the Vietnamese Fatherland Front, and there's a whole thing about left-wing and anti-colonial nationalism to be done here. But for now, understand that this was not so unusual in the early Cold War as global North leftists might find it. No, this is not me going on a pat sock or progressive patriotism arc. Those people are generally totally unserious and have no real way of reckoning with the societies they live in. Anyway, back to topic. The Viet Cong are pretty unambiguously the good guys, right? I mean, George Lucas isn't famous for creating a very complex morality tale in Star Wars, but the Rebel Alliance and probably the Ewoks, but let's not think too much about the implications of that right this very second, were based on resistance movements like the Viet Cong. The technological asymmetry, the sheer force of the empire, it all signals America, even if all the bad guys have British accents, which in fairness, I get it. Now, the Ewoks may be pretty morally clean, but the Viet Cong were not, and they did some pretty horrible things. This is a common theme in this video. When confronted by invasion, occupation, and oppression, people tend to react, and their reactions aren't always perfectly measured. or perfectly in line with the customs and laws of war, or even with the basic human decency you would expect from people. To give an example, the Viet Cong bombed the US Embassy in South Vietnam and killed several civilians doing so, and they regularly would go and extort taxes from Vietnamese people under their control. The Viet Cong still represented the oppressed and aggrieved party. That doesn't mean they didn't break the laws or customs, just that these things don't happen in a vacuum. That when political settlements are off the table and you're confronted with an enemy like the United States or the South Vietnamese who allowed them to act on their behalf, who would do things like the My Lai massacre or the use of Agent Orange as part of an ecocide campaign, whose health impacts are still felt today in Vietnam. When confronted by oppression, invasion, and particularly a perceived occupier aided by collaborators, and who has no regard for your life, you might feel compelled not just to act, but to align with groups who aren't the best representation of either your beliefs or your particular desires beyond getting the occupier to leave. What about that term colonialism? This one tends to really upset people when used in reference to Palestine, and a lot of people who don't really know about concepts like indigeneity or what the process of colonialism looks like and results in are really reluctant to really engage with it, especially because they imagine what the solution would be, and they always imagine the absolute worst thing they can, which is usually the expulsion or murder of the colonizing group. That's not necessarily how these things have to end, but a lot of particularly white people tend to evoke lurid images of mass expulsion of Jews from Israel should the Palestinians be allowed to return to their land and be given the rights that they should have. In the context of the particular history of Jewish people, those are understandably emotive and harrowing images, and these images are often used to justify two particular things. One, to justify the apartheid status quo, the occupation and the disenfranchisement of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. I'd argue beyond that, but for now let's just try and keep it narrow. Two, to justify the denial of the right of return to Palestinians who were expelled from their land because it would end the Jewish-Israeli majority in the area currently recognized as Israel. Point one, I think through the course of the video and really just basic observation, they're pretty easy to refute and refuse. There can be no justification for the crime of apartheid. There can be no justification for continuing to refuse the victims of genocide in the form of the Nakba and their descendants the right of return to their homeland. You might be about to make a particular point in the comments, and before you say Jews were the victims of genocide and Israel is their ancestral homeland and storming off, I promise we're about to get to it. The second point is one you run across often being unironically boosted by centrist journalists in the Anglophone world, and sentiments similar to it are regularly expressed by Israeli politicians. There are problems with this, namely that if the existence of your state requires a specific ethno-religious group to permanently be in the majority, then there's no way to maintain that that's really compatible with basic humanity, or really worth it. People who advocate this position are able to do so and claim things like Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, despite them being mutually exclusive, given that you can't have a meaningful democracy under occupation, and that colonial states can't be democratic in a meaningful way, especially when you add in the apartheid element of it. There's an obvious issue, which is that millions of people are under the control of a government that they have no say in or control over. They are unable to participate in political life, given that to be a legal political party in Israel, you must recognize its right to exist in a condition approximating the status quo. You will also notice this law is not applied strictly, telling you who it is intended to target. So even Israeli Arabs, that is, the Palestinians who live within the internationally recognized Israeli territory, which I still maintain is occupied territory, who may wish for the establishment of a plurinational, secular state which does not have an inherently Jewish character, can't. They have no legal means to participate in political life because of the party's law passed by the Knesset. All of this falls on deaf ears because fundamentally a large part of the Anglophonic and wider European press political ecosystem, the Israeli political class, and if we are to take incidents like the residents in Sderot, one of the places attacked by the Islamic resistance movement on October 7th in 2014, watching and cheering as bombs were dropped on Gaza, a significant portion of Israeli civil society does not regard the Palestinians, including Israeli Arabs, as full equal people. There's no use appealing to a shared humanity in these people because they don't believe it exists. The role of colonialism in all of this is one of those things where people look at the situation and kind of shrug because understanding colonialism is not strictly in their interest a lot of the time. Plus, they're usually thrown by the Israeli claim of that territory as a historic Jewish homeland. There's also been an appropriation of rhetoric where Israelis will claim to be indigenous and therefore unable to be colonizers. Before I untangle the confusing mess that this is, I just want to point out that this kind of appropriation of rhetoric associated with social justice, the left, decolonial thought, whatever you may think of it as, is something that the right and people who want to oppress do all the time. Partially because these people are trolling us and baiting outrage reactions, and also because our rhetoric is popular. Neither of these tendencies are new. The right and far right and associated ethno-nationalists have stolen the left's clothes on many occasions, but there's something that rankles about it when indigeneity is manipulated in this way. Let's take an example where it's widely accepted by hopefully all of us that settler colonialism is what happened. America. It's well documented that I don't like it very much, and one of the reasons is that its existed is founded upon the extermination of indigenous peoples. But who are the indigenous peoples in the territory of the United States, and what makes them indigenous? The broadest definition for indigenous in the context of the Western Hemisphere is people who are descended from those who lived there before the presence of European colonists. And before anyone gets cute, I'm not counting Leif Erikson and the events of the saga of Eric the Red, because they didn't really stick around for very long or engage in the specific process that's meant by colonialism. America and Canada, on the other hand, very much did engage in this. You may have heard in the American case of Manifest Destiny, white settlers thought that they were destined to settle all the way to the Pacific and bring the way of life they had established along the East Coast, established at the cost of indigenous people in that area, all the way to the Pacific. One of the specific mechanisms was the Indian Removal Act, which is pretty clear in its genocidal intent, and forced Native American tribes out of their ancestral homelands and led to the Trail of Tears, a situation that will feel familiar to contemporary events. Indigenous people resisted with force. I do want to say that Manifest Destiny was not an uncontested idea before anyone gets, or how could anyone know any better? Again, people did know better. This pattern of displacement, resistance, political manipulation, and utility, such as the War of 1812 and the American Civil War, where various indigenous groups sided with different sides based on who was promising them rights, and ultimately the destruction of the indigenous way of life and replacing it with the colonial way of life was and is being repeated in Israel. I think that people would be hard-pressed to justify the idea that Native Americans and First Peoples shouldn't have resisted this destruction of their way of life. It doesn't mean that some won't try, of course, but America was going to manifest its destiny. It wasn't going to stop or be stopped, even when it had presidents who were critical of or opposed to the idea, because as much as their personal feelings may not have been in favor of it, the nature of the state and the national project they helmed meant that white settlers kept trickling west. Things like the Louisiana Purchase and Mexican-American War happened, and the UK and US almost went to war over the killing of a Berkshire pig. Notice the names of a lot of those events and the countries involved in it. Louisiana, a colony of France. Mexico, a settler colonial state. The UK, look, do I even need to really explain it with Britain? And possibly the worst of all, Canada. None of these are the names of indigenous groups. The process of colonialism happened in what's now America, under various regimes to various extents and with various consequences, but always bad consequences for the indigenous people. Hopefully this long walk through colonialism is giving you a clue as to what makes indigenous people indigenous. It's not the simple fact of having an ancestral historic or cultural connection to a specific area of the world. In that case, going to certain Turkish nationalists, I would be indigenous to Mongolia. An idea that if I were to present that to you, that you'd recognize as absurd. Instead, it's not about that connection as such, it is an imposed status, one that is imposed by colonizers. And that is about a way of life in relation to that land that's destroyed by a colonizer. In that sense, most Israeli Jews cannot really be considered indigenous. They have a connection to that land, certainly given how many have been born there. There's a historic and cultural relationship that they have that's corroborated by contemporary sources at the time of their ancestors' exile into the diaspora. And while that might create an emotional attachment to the land, that's not indigeneity. The fact is that historic and contemporary oppression outside of your colonial state does not make you not a colonizer. Even opposition to an election of leaders skeptical of it, as America did with Manifest Destiny, can't really change that at a fundamental level. This question of oppression is one that often complicates our feelings about this conflict, so it needs to be addressed directly. Something that I encounter living in the UK is people not really understanding what oppression is and who is oppressed. In the heat of the moment, when something flares up or escalates, I have to admit, British people, they sometimes have a good instinct for it, right? For example, most polling indicates broad public support for a ceasefire in Gaza, in opposition to virtually every major UK-wide political party, whose position seems to be broadly defined as whatever Joe Biden says. I wanted to spend a section of this video addressing the issue of oppression and who is responsible for oppression and the reactions to it. And also, it's important to point out that the oppressor-oppressed dynamic is often a false dichotomy. You can be both. I want to approach this issue because there are very real historical and contemporary phenomena that people who think the Israeli Jews are generally oppressed are reacting to. There are also people who think that the Palestinians are fundamentally to blame for their oppression and act as if they chose who their oppressor would be. For what purpose? We'll find out in a bit. Let's start with the Israelis, particularly Israeli Jews. Are they oppressed? In keeping with the theme of this video, that is at once simple to answer on a factual level in the context of Palestine and Palestinians, but complicated by feelings, real historic and contemporary events, and tendencies among Europeans and their settler colonies, generational trauma, and the specific instigating incident for this escalation in genocidal violence towards Palestinians. Starting with history is the best idea here, probably, because it's the part more or less everyone, unless you're a fascist, agrees with in a factual sense. Jewish people have been historically persecuted in Europe. When we learn the history of the Holocaust, it's important for us to take in that those things happened, and they happened to real people. That will have a serious impact not just on those who survived it, but generations after. It disproved in the minds of a lot of people the idea that European Jews could safely be part of modern European societies. It wasn't the only event that did this. In modern Europe alone, you could include events like the Dreyfus Affair, in which a Jewish military officer from the recently lost territory of Alsace-Lorraine, and whose first language was German, was scapegoated for the communication of French military secrets to Germany. There's a good short video that covers the essentials on this, which I'll link in the description. You may have heard that the Dreyfus Affair was one of the instigating events that persuaded the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, to move away from the position of assimilation, since he was a journalist following the whole thing. That's the story I knew, but apparently there's some dispute around that, but it's worth noting that he himself said it, and while he may have been exaggerating to generate sympathy for his ideological positions, I don't really know for sure. I'm not that kind of historian, or any kind of historian, really. You can go further back, of course. You can cite the example of the People's Crusade and the Rhineland massacres. My point in reminding you all of this is that there's a history that requires a degree of sensitivity and understanding. When the events of October 7th happened, a lot of Jewish people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, felt traumatized by it. And that's an entirely understandable response to it. The pain expressed by people impacted by this is real. It is rooted in a deep history that contains many tragedies, and sometimes when we see pain, we have to acknowledge that it's not necessarily the most important thing in a given situation. That doesn't mean we aren't sensitive to it, that we don't sympathize with it, but the root cause of the pain in this instance was preventable, and largely the responsibility of an oppressor in the oppressor-oppressed dynamic that we see in Palestine. There is a proliferation of a belief that Israeli Jews are oppressed, and if an Israeli Jew were to be visibly Jewish in a European country, it is very possible that they would be the victim of anti-Semitism. In fact, I'm led to understand that the Israeli government has warned Israeli citizens to not go to certain countries and to be careful around that. And there is a sense that anti-Semitism is on the rise in European societies, and there seems to be anecdotal corroboration of that. What's the cause of this rise? Well, in a general background sense, outside of the press focus on specific events, it's likely to be a resurging far right. To give an example, Germany's political class seems to have adopted the position that anti-Semitism is bad, which is good, especially given the specific history there, but that it's been brought to Germany by Muslims in particular. While I would look at the far-right Alternative for Deutschland polling at above 20% and wonder if that might have more of a causal relationship with it. That being said, there is a surge in these incidents, and they are often associated with two factors. One, increased press visibility of Jewish people, and a prolonged period of national print and broadcast media focus on them. And this occurs in the UK with virtually every minority group when this happens to them. See Turkish people in the 2016 EU referendum, or Albanians during one of the recent migration panics in the UK. Two, any intensification of violence in Gaza and the West Bank. This is also a function of press attention, since in the UK at least, Israel's various interventions and bombing campaigns in Gaza are covered in almost a unique way, like almost unlike any other event. It's hard to describe how it's covered in the UK. It's actually very different. And I should point out that there is a tendency for anti-Semites to try to wrap themselves in the flag of the Palestinian cause. We need to be vigilant of that and aware of that. And there's also an important point here, which is why it's important for us to make the distinction between Jewish people generally and the Israeli state. Even if communal bodies like the Board of Deputies in the UK generally support the Israeli government and host anti-mixed marriage ambassador to the UK, Tzipi Hotovele, because random Jewish people have as much to do with Israel's policy as I do with Turkey's. The point is that while an Israeli Jew might experience anti-Semitism in, for example, the UK, they can be both a victim and a perpetrator of oppression. They might suffer from the consequences of white supremacy, structural racism, and associated impediments on their life, and when they return to Israel, they are part of the empowered racial group that benefits from structural racism. Yes, it might be irritating and alarming that rockets from Gaza fly overhead, but looking at the casualty numbers and general events since the Oslo Accords, you can't help but notice that one side has suffered way less disruption to their lives and way less loss of life. That takes us to the Palestinians. Very plainly the oppressed party here, and their plight is also emotive. I mentioned that whenever an escalation occurs in Gaza, that it's covered rather uniquely in the UK, and that's impacted my relationship to it. I remember vividly seeing the skyline of Gaza on TV for hours at a time. It is almost seared into my mind. The specifics of the plight of the Palestinians are not really what I want to get into here. What I want to address is the question of whether Palestinians are oppressing the Israelis or are motivated by a desire to oppress them. You might be looking at me like I'm divorced from reality, or even wanting to explore that, but there does seem to be a strain of thought that considers the Palestinians as oppressors and as solely motivated by anti-Semitism. Is it inconvenient when you're attacked by rockets? Certainly. I don't think anyone thinks that it's some privilege to be attacked, but these attacks don't happen in a vacuum. Throughout the video, I've described situations which directly relate to the plight of the Palestinians. I think to deny their oppression, as some try to, is absurd, and to say that they have no right to retaliate or resist that is also absurd. So while Israelis may feel oppressed, they're not in this specific situation. They are the beneficiaries of an oppressive structure. You need only to look at the lives they're able to lead in comparison to the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. Israel is the more powerful party in this situation, and the more powerful party has more responsibility for the conduct of war and their occupations. If Israel doesn't wish to be the subject of rocket attacks from the Islamic resistance movements or their allies in the Party of God or various other aligned groups, then the solution is simple: to take responsibility and stop doing the things that I've mentioned earlier. They have the power, almost all of the power. I need to address the idea of Palestinian anti-Semitism and the framing of it as the main motivator here. Let me just say that to boil the Palestinian desire for liberation to anti-Semitism does not make sense. You might point to the Islamic resistance movement's official ideology and positions and say, well, what about that then? And yes, it does exist. But the Islamic resistance movement is not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not them. They are a group among a politically diverse set of armed resistances to Israel, and there is very little evidence that either the Gazan or wider Palestinian civil society subscribes wholesale to their ideology. As some are so fond of pointing out, the Palestinians did elect the Islamic resistance movement, but they did it in 2006. The median age in Gaza is 18. A significant majority of the population would have been too young to vote for them. Are they to be condemned forever as a result? To frame their desire for liberation as anti-Semitism is to make a fundamentally flawed proposition, that the Palestinians chose their oppressors so that they could act on racial hatred. This is a fundamental misunderstanding not dissimilar to the mistakes made about indigeneity. If you're part of an oppressed group, you know what I'm about to say. But to be clear, the oppressed do not choose their oppressor. To suggest that that's even possible is to act as if some people want to be oppressed. And while white British people do sometimes look for an excuse to frame themselves as such, they would never really take the place of an oppressed person if that offer could be made. The primary responsibility for this ongoing colonial project, the apartheid, and as I'll discuss in a second, the genocide, lies with the one with the power to stop it. That is Israel, the oppressive party in this issue. The Islamic resistance movement and other groups are of course responsible for what they do. They should be held accountable, but to ignore where the real power lies and the circumstances that led to this is to explicitly take the side of an oppressor. A friend of mine, a friend of the channel, John Duncan, made a video on this specific topic of genocide, and I really appreciated it, and a lot of the observations here were made in a more refined way in his video, and they actually really refined some of my observations back. So I guess check out his video because it's really good, but not all of this is strictly going to be original TM, but I am going to hopefully come at this from a different enough angle that it's not just me repeating his work. Plus, I'm going to try and keep this section brief, but there will be a thing taking you to John's video or a link or whatever. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm doing with my hands there. Genocide is a word that carries a lot of weight, as it should. It's a crime that we're taught to regard as among the gravest people could commit. And that's completely correct. Why then, when UN officials are resigning because of the international community's failure to intervene meaningfully in the case of genocide in Gaza, do so many resist acknowledging it for what it is? First of all, let's look to a definition of genocide. Article 2. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, A. Killing members of the group. B. causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This is rather more detailed and has a lot more applicable cases than what people think genocide is. I've encountered people who say something along the lines of, if Israel was intending to commit genocide, it's doing so in a very inefficient way and we'd all be able to see that it was happening. Usually on Blue Sky, where I'm spending most of my social media time these days, this comes from a person whose first language is German, which is concerning for a lot of different reasons. The most frustrating aspect of this is we're able to see it happening. Israeli politicians and civil society, the parts that support this, are not hiding what they're going to do and what they want to do and what they are doing. To give just an example, dozens of Israeli doctors signed a letter urging the bombing of hospitals in Gaza, a war crime intended to prevent access to medical treatment, to destroy the Palestinian people, to inflict serious bodily or mental harm upon them, simply for being Palestinian. We see these events with our lying eyes. Hospitals are bombed, civilians who are offered safe passage are bombed, and then when emergency vehicles arrive, they are also bombed. Refugee camps are struck by missiles in order to get one person. For all of the Islamic resistance movement hides behind human shields arguments, that's an argument that's rendered irrelevant by Israel's callous disregard for Palestinian life. When confronted by a human shield, you're not meant to shoot the shield. A common understanding of what genocide is that it's when a lot of people in a group are killed for being in that group of people. But that's incomplete, as we see from the legal definition. It's not about a number or just about killing, but an intent. When intent is the marker of guilt, a perceived lack of efficiency or the fact that Gaza has had population growth over a given period, which is something that people love to throw in your face, does not disprove genocide. Others cite the existence of Arab Israelis as a counter to the charge of genocide, when they are the remnants of a people who were expelled and killed during the Nakba. Their survival does not disprove the genocidal nature of what's been happening for the past 75 years. To make these arguments puts you in the same category as Turkish nationalists who claimed that the Armenian genocide didn't happen because the Ottomans didn't target Armenians who lived in Western Anatolia. That's not how genocide works, and if you think that's how it works, you should consider the company that you're in. This denial is not just factually incorrect, it's abhorrent. We can see it with our own eyes. For those who say, how can you prove intent? The disregard for Palestinian life may not be enough to convince you, but the order for the civilian population to move to southern Gaza had echoes of the Nakba, the targeting of hospitals, the siege that prevented food, fuel, water, and so many other things from entering Gaza. The politicians and journalists in Israel openly calling for Nakba 2, among other colourful phrases, and a policy document dated the 13th of October of this year suggesting the expulsion of Palestinians to the Sinai Peninsula. When confronted by genocide and genocidal intent, it's human to want to survive, to want to live. Even if Israel were to succeed in its stated objectives for this escalation, the genocide, which has been ongoing for decades, will continue, and they will continue to meet resistance. It's not just that the Palestinians or any such oppressed, occupied, and colonized people have the right under international law to resist it, which they do. It's human nature to resist. To those that say the Palestinians or the Islamic resistance movement went too far on October 7th and that it should have engaged in non-violent resistance, it might surprise you to know that the Palestinians have tried that. An example is the Great March of Return, which was mostly a peaceful protest, and to be clear, just non-violent protests have a role to play in all of this. You know, meet hate with love and all of that. But what did the Gazans get in return? 223 killed and 9,200 wounded. What do we want the Palestinians to do? What do we expect them to do? If what we expect is for them to accept some kind of peace that resembles the status quo, to legitimize a state that is quite literally dancing on their ancestors' graves, let me ask you this. Would we accept such a peace? If not, why not? And what would we do to get more favourable terms? We need to start thinking of other people as, well, people, but then we need to start thinking of them as complex. The problems themselves might be simple, but there's a lot of feelings and traumas to navigate. As of recording, Israel is conducting a ground operation in Gaza City with continued bombardments. Benjamin Netanyahu suggested that if Israel achieves its objectives, that it will be in control of Gaza's security. Well, more in control for the foreseeable future. While it's worth pointing out that there seems to be very little political appetite in Israel and among its allies for a return to the days of settlements in Gaza, it's not far-fetched to be suspicious that this is where it will eventually lead, and that it will eventually lead to reoccupation or illegal annexation. The demands then are simple: an immediate ceasefire, a withdrawal of Israel from Gaza, and finally an addressing of the underlying causes of the escalation, primarily the occupation of the Palestinians. That's all well and good, and we should demand these things, but it relies on a flawed premise, which is that Israel will stop voluntarily and do these things. Like the Western Hemisphere settler colonies of old, they cannot and will not stop. Which, given that there's fighting on the Lebanese border with the Party of God, escalating settler violence in the West Bank, missiles being fired from Yemen, and US troops being attacked in Iraq and Syria, leaves the potential for a series of very dangerous escalations. That's why we have a role to play as people in the global north. I'll speak to the UK specifically here, but this will apply to pretty much any country in the global north. Our government provides diplomatic cover for Israel. Our political class is united behind essentially a pro-genocide position. We can exert pressure on them through protest, through organising in our trade unions to block weapons shipments and show solidarity, and we can do it through direct action groups as well. We can make a difference to this here because the UK has an outsized responsibility for the current situation, being both a former colonial power in the region and an ally of Israel. It will also require internal pressure, and that's not our responsibility as such, but it's worth remembering that there are people in Israel across the communities who live there who oppose the occupation and all of the things I've mentioned in this video. It's probably quite a lonely position to hold, and they are our allies in this too. We also have to look to the past. South Africa was made into a pariah. Israel should be made into a pariah if it refuses to do the right thing, and that means engaging in these conversations. It means direct action, and it means BDS. Israel's supporters are especially upset when you engage in cultural boycotts of Israel because it relegates them to the status of a rogue state, which they are, a nuclear-armed rogue state, one that flouts international law and thinks it can do as it pleases because it can. So long as the US and UK and its various other allies in the global north perceive it as feasible and necessary to support the colonial project. It's long past time for this to stop. Not just the most recent escalation, but the decades of colonialism, occupation, and genocide. A group of Palestinians lashed out, possibly in a way that they knew would be futile, knowing Israel would respond in this way. How many innocent people need to die before we decide that the desire for vengeance is satisfied? I'm sincerely asking because people seem to put different value into different lives. Until we break that, this can't end. In terms of specific longer-term solutions, one state or two states, the solution is best epitomized in that chant. From river to sea, Palestine will be free. Palestine, where the Palestinian refugees are allowed to return to their ancestral lands, where they can participate as full citizens, and where there is finally something resembling a democracy in that land, where all of the people of that land can live freely and safely. Is it idealistic? Yes, but we need to be in the darkest times. I need to thank my proofreaders, my partner, who proofread it, I'm not just thanking her generally, and a friend of mine who I will not name or anything, who is a left-wing Israeli and put their eye to this script. It was very necessary and it really, really helped me be grounded in all of this. So thank you. Thank you to Emir. I think I already thanked him, but thank you to Emir who made the thumbnail again. If I already thanked him, I'm a little tired. It's a little late for me to be recording. I also need to ask you all to like, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, share the video. I think this one is not going to do very well in the algorithm, so I need you to share this video. I also need to thank my patrons, particularly Drone Riff Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, and John N, who are the top tier subscribers. I also need to point out, because this is the content creator thing, where we have YouTube memberships now, and I haven't made any of the like specific benefits for it, but you can basically get the Patreon stuff with YouTube memberships. But please, if you are considering joining, consider donating to a cause for the Palestinians. I will have a couple of suggestions in the description. Please, before you do Patreon, before you join a YouTube membership, please just look in the description and find something there. Or find something else. Just find whatever you want, but just donate what you would have spent on it to the Palestinians. They need it more than I do. I also want to say that on the day of release, there is supposed to be a protest happening, most notably in London, in support of the Palestinians. I just want to wish everyone going on that, if you're watching this on the way or something, best of luck. Stay safe. Do all the usual good protesty stuff, and yeah, just stay safe, take it easy, stay frosty, and I will catch everyone on the next video.